Like,
My camera don't
and then
work.
like get rich, and then I'm gonna build a big ass house, and then I'm gonna party with my friends. I just wanna get rich, and then like,
My camera don't
and then
work.
like get rich, and then I'm gonna build a big ass house, and then I'm gonna party with my friends.
Let me ask you something. If your son disappeared on an island, and you were told he simply decided to stay behind, but then you discovered his phone appeared to be somewhere else, would you believe that explanation? Or would you start asking questions? Now listen to this.
Oh, these little liars. I told y'all that Jax was the ringleader. I told y'all. He sat in this interview and he was telling stories about shit that he wasn't even there to witness. So let's break down some of the stuff that I heard in this interview. Let's start with Warren's first phone call, because y'all will remember that Warren said that he was over at Ava's house for that 4th of July party when they all started realizing that Nolan was missing, and he called Miss Christine at 11 o'clock.
One of the first things I told Miss Christine Wells in the first phone call that ever occurred with anything to do with Nolan Wells being gone, because I was the first person to call Miss Christine about anything. First phone call, anything to do with Nolan Wells, was me making a phone call to Christine Wells. And one of the first things I said to her, with multiple witnesses here, pull up the phone call if you want. She said, oh, well, Nolan's location is with y'all at, where the house we were at. And I was like, well, no, he left his phone with us. I told her this.
And yesterday, the same time that this interview came out, Christine Wells said this.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, well, we have his phone.
So both versions of the story say that Warren didn't tell her about the phone until after she confronted him with the 360.
Where was he? Who had his phone? When did that phone move? And what happened during the hours nobody can completely explain? Because those are the questions surrounding the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells. And the deeper investigators look into his final hours, the more complicated the timeline becomes. There are questions surrounding his phone.
Showing everywhere the phone had been, I was like, well, it's showing that he's back on land, he's like, but no, he didn't come back with us.
Questions about a Coast Guard communication. Questions about a Snapchat photograph. Questions about a confrontation involving Nolan's family. Questions about a 911 call. And questions about what happened during a critical period before Nolan disappeared.
We want to know what happened to our child. Everything else is just, it's just clickbait and everything. It's about what happened to our child.
But here's what makes this case even more difficult. Nolan's official state autopsy has now been completed. The results have not been released publicly. Instead, the findings are expected to be presented to a grand jury along with the rest of the investigative evidence. ABC 7 New York. At the same time, Nolan's family says his phone is ready for a joint forensic examination, but that examination has not yet happened. And according to the family's attorneys, disagreements over how the examination should be conducted have delayed it. So think about that for a moment. The body has been recovered. The independent autopsy has already been performed. The official autopsy is complete. The phone is available. A grand jury is waiting. And yet, we still don't have a public answer to the most basic question. What happened to Nolan Wells?
I don't know what happened to Nolan. My friends don't know what happened to Nolan.
Today, we're going through the unanswered questions surrounding his final hours, the conflicting accounts, the evidence that still needs to be examined, and the developments that could determine where this case goes next. But before we get into it, if you want to see this case followed as new information comes out, hit the like button and subscribe to Midnight True Crime. Because this isn't about deciding someone's guilt from behind a screen. It's about separating what we know from what we don't. And the first place we need to look is Nolan's phone. On July 4th, Nolan Wells went to Horn Island with friends. At some point, the group returned to the mainland. Nolan did not.
We always taught him to, if you go with a group, you stay with a group.
His friends said he had decided to remain behind. The explanation was that he wanted to spend more time with a girl and believed he had another way to get back.
They met that day, and it was kind of one of those things. It did come off that day that he really did like her, but that was the only time they'd ever hung out was at Horn Island on July 4th.
But Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, had trouble accepting that explanation. Not simply because her son had stayed behind, but because of what happened with his phone. Christine reportedly checked location information connected to Nolan's phone, and what she saw raised an immediate problem.
Showing everywhere the phone had been, like it had, I was like, well, it's showing that he's back on land, like I'm not. He's like, but no, he didn't come back with us.
The phone appeared to have returned to the mainland, but Nolan supposedly hadn't. That creates a very simple question. If Nolan stayed on the island, how did the phone associated with him get back?
Everywhere the phone had been, like it had, I was like, well, it's showing that he's back on land, like I'm not. He's like, but no, he didn't come back with us.
And this is where the story becomes more complicated. The family's concerns weren't limited to the location. They also questioned what was or wasn't on the device. Nolan was 18 years old. Like many people his age, his phone was part of his everyday life. His family expected there to be photographs, messages, social media activity, evidence of what he had been doing on July 4th. But his mother has publicly questioned the lack of expected content from that day. And now the phone itself has become a major point of contention. The family's attorneys say they are ready to make it available for a joint forensic examination.
We want to know what happened to our child. Everything else is just, it's just clickbait and everything. It's about what happened to our child.
They have proposed an examination involving experts on both sides, with possible FBI participation. But as of the latest reporting, that examination has not taken place. That matters, because a forensic examination could potentially answer questions that witness memories cannot. A phone can contain timestamps, location information, application activity, messages, photographs, metadata, and sometimes even information associated with deleted material. But none of that should be assumed to exist on Nolan's phone until forensic experts actually examine it. That's the important distinction. The phone might answer questions. It might contradict some accounts. It might support them. Or it might reveal very little. Nobody can responsibly know until the examination happens. And that's why the disagreement over the phone has become so important. Because if investigators are trying to reconstruct Nolan's final hours, the digital timeline could be one of the clearest ways to establish where his device was and when. But the phone isn't the only part of the timeline that has raised questions. There's another communication from that night, and this one involves the Coast Guard.
We're being towed here, but you're also calling Cito for a tow. So why would you call Cito for a tow when you're already being towed?
Because they needed an alibi. They needed an alibi.
When someone disappears from an island, communication with emergency authorities can become critical. The timing matters. Who was contacted? When were they contacted? What exactly were they told? And what action followed? Questions emerged around a Coast Guard communication connected to Nolan's disappearance.
Those seeking truth and accountability in the Nolan Wells case have every right to continue asking questions and demanding answers because we are America and we have a right to the First Amendment. That includes Black people and all people.
There were differing accounts about when the Coast Guard had been notified and how that communication occurred. The details matter because a personal contact with someone who works for the Coast Guard is not necessarily the same thing as an official emergency notification. But even here, we need to be careful. A confusing timeline does not automatically mean someone was deliberately hiding information. There can be misunderstandings. People can remember conversations differently, and emergency situations can create chaos. What matters is whether official records can establish what happened. Was there a call? What time was it? Who made it? What information was provided? And what did the person receiving the communication understand? Those are questions that can potentially be answered through records rather than speculation. And that is exactly how this case needs to be approached. Because the goal isn't to find something suspicious. The goal is to determine what actually happened. And that becomes even more important when we look at another piece of digital evidence: Snapchat. Social media has become an important part of the Nolan Wells investigation because posts, photographs, and videos can sometimes provide timestamps that help reconstruct a person's movements. But timestamps can also be misunderstood. One photograph discussed publicly in connection with Nolan's final hours has raised questions about when it was actually posted. The issue is straightforward. A person described the photograph as something that had been circulating on the night of July 4th. But questions were later raised about whether that specific image was actually posted on July 5th. If the photograph being discussed is not the same photograph that was circulating earlier, the apparent contradiction could disappear. If it is the same photograph, however, then the timeline needs an explanation, and that is why the original digital file matters. A screenshot isn't necessarily enough. A screen recording isn't necessarily enough. A social media timestamp displayed on a screen may not tell the entire story. The independent analytical review conducted in this case reportedly warned that social media timestamps should not be treated as definitive without access to original files and associated metadata. The Washington Informer. That's an important point, because in a case where minutes matter, investigators need the strongest version of the evidence available, not screenshots passed around online, not assumptions, not edited clips, the original data. And that principle applies to almost every disputed detail in Nolan's case. Now we get to the bigger issue, the timeline. An independent analytical review of photographs, videos, GPS information, and witness accounts reportedly identified what it described as a material gap between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the reported departure of the boat. The Washington Informer. A material gap. In other words, there is a period of time where the available evidence does not establish exactly what happened. And that's the part investigators need to understand. Because if you can establish where Nolan was at point A and where the boat was at point B, you still have to account for everything that happened in between. Who was with him, who saw him, what boats were nearby, who left, who stayed, when did they leave, and what happened immediately before Nolan disappeared. The analytical review did not conclude that someone committed a crime. It did not assign criminal responsibility. Instead, it identified information that investigators may still need to resolve. That's an important distinction, because the gap itself is not proof of foul play. It is simply a gap. But in a death investigation, gaps matter, especially when they occur during the final known period of a person's life. Then there is what happened after Nolan's family began searching for answers. According to accounts that have circulated publicly, Nolan's family went looking for information and eventually confronted people connected to the July 4th gathering. The subject of those conversations included Nolan's whereabouts, his phone, and the boat. There was also a 911 call connected to the family's arrival at a residence. Again, this needs to be handled carefully. A 911 call does not tell us why someone made the call. It tells us that someone believed the situation warranted emergency assistance. To understand what actually happened, investigators would need the full recording and surrounding context. What was reported to the dispatcher? Who was present? What had happened immediately beforehand? And what did responding officers document? Those details matter because a later reconstruction of events depends heavily on contemporaneous records. Memory changes, people remember events differently, but a time-stamped 911 call is an independent record. So is a dispatch log, so is a phone record, so is authenticated video. That's why investigators need to bring all of these pieces together, not one at a time, together. Then came one of the most important developments in the case. Nolan's family commissioned an independent autopsy. The result did not provide the definitive answer they were hoping for. The independent examination determined that Nolan's cause and manner of death were undetermined pending investigation. CBS News. That wording is important. It does not say Nolan was murdered. It does not say he was drowned. It does not say someone else caused his death. It says the examination could not establish the cause and manner with certainty. The family attorney also reported that the examiner could not rule out foul play. Again, that does not mean foul play occurred. It means the available evidence did not allow the examiner to eliminate that possibility. The independent examination also reportedly documented red discoloration in tissue at the back of Nolan's head, although the reason for that finding remained unclear. There were also limitations to the examination. The body had already undergone decomposition, and certain anatomical material had been retained by the state medical examiner, which limited what the independent pathologist could assess. That is why the official autopsy is so important, because the state examination may contain information that the independent examiner could not obtain. And now, that official autopsy has been completed. As of the latest official statements, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's autopsy has been completed, but the findings have not been released publicly. Instead, the case materials, including the autopsy report, are expected to be presented to a Jackson County grand jury once the investigation is complete. This has understandably created frustration for people following the case. But the district attorney has now made her position clear. On August 18th, Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath said she is obligated to present the grand jury with the evidence collected in the case so that it can make its decision based on a thorough investigation and the law. She also cautioned the public against assuming that everything circulating online is accurate or complete. https://www.locks. That warning matters. Because this case has become enormous online, and when information is missing, people naturally try to fill the gaps, but that's where misinformation can spread. A screenshot can be misinterpreted, a statement can be taken out of context, an alleged document can turn out to be fake, and a theory repeated thousands of times can start sounding like a fact, simply because so many people have heard it. That is exactly what investigators need to avoid. The evidence has to be tested, not voted on, not decided by social media, tested. And eventually, a grand jury will review the official evidence. And this brings us back to Nolan's phone, because while the autopsy is complete, the phone has reportedly still not undergone the joint forensic examination the family says it is prepared to facilitate. The family's attorneys say they offered dates in August for the examination and requested that their forensic experts be allowed to participate. The disagreement appears to center on how the phone should be transferred and examined. That may sound like a technical legal issue, but technically, it is exactly that. Digital evidence has to be handled properly. Who takes possession? How is it preserved? Who creates the forensic image? Who verifies the integrity of the data? Who gets access? How are findings documented? These aren't minor details. If the goal is to use a phone as evidence, the examination has to be performed in a way that both sides can scrutinize. And that's why the proposed joint examination matters. If it eventually happens, investigators may finally be able to compare the phone's digital record against the accounts surrounding Nolan's disappearance. And that could be significant, because one of the central questions in this case has always been simple: where was Nolan's phone? But the bigger question is, who had it, and what happened to it during those critical hours? At this point, let's strip away everything that has been speculated online. Here's what is established. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He went to Horn Island for a July 4th gathering with friends. He did not return with them. His body was recovered from the water near Horn Island on July 6th. His family's independent autopsy could not determine the cause or manner of death. The official state autopsy has been completed, but its findings have not been publicly released.
Now,
the case is expected to go before a grand jury. The family continues to pursue an independent investigation. The phone has not yet undergone the proposed joint forensic examination, and there remain unanswered questions about the timeline surrounding Nolan's final hours. Those are facts. Beyond that, we have competing accounts, interpretations, and questions, and that distinction needs to remain clear, because no one has been publicly charged with causing Nolan's death. The sheriff's office has previously said investigators found no evidence indicating foul play. So this is not a case where we can simply announce a conclusion. It's a case where investigators still have to determine what happened, and that makes the evidence even more important. The next major stage is the grand jury. The state autopsy findings will eventually be presented alongside the other evidence gathered during the investigation. That evidence could include witness statements, digital records, emergency communications, search information, photographs and videos, forensic findings, and whatever additional evidence investigators have collected. The grand jury will then determine whether the evidence supports moving forward with criminal proceedings. But there is another piece that could become important before then: the phone. If the forensic examination happens, it could help establish a digital timeline. And if investigators can establish the timeline, some of the disputed accounts may become easier to evaluate. That's what this case needs, not another theory, a timeline. Because once you know where the people were, when the phones moved, when calls were made, when photographs were taken, when boats departed, and when Nolan was last independently confirmed to be alive, the number of possible explanations begins to narrow. That's how cold cases move forward, one verified fact at a time. And if you've stayed with me this far, you can probably see why this case is so difficult. There are questions everywhere, but questions aren't conclusions. And that's exactly why we're going to keep following the evidence instead of pretending we already know the answer. If you want to follow the next major development, especially the autopsy findings, the phone examination, and what eventually happens before the grand jury, like this video and subscribe to Midnight True Crime, because when the evidence changes, the story changes with it. And now, we need to look at the one thing that connects almost everything we've discussed, the missing hours. Think about the timeline again. Nolan is on Horn Island. His friends eventually leave. Nolan remains behind. At some point, the people with him believe he has another way home. His family later learns he isn't coming back. The phone appears to be somewhere it shouldn't be. Questions are raised. The family starts looking for answers. Authorities become involved. And 2 days later, Nolan's body is found. But somewhere between those events is the period investigators still need to reconstruct. The final hours. That's the heart of the case. Because if Nolan simply drowned accidentally, investigators should ultimately be able to build an evidence-based explanation for how and when that happened. If the evidence shows something else, investigators need to determine what that is. But right now, the public does not have enough evidence to make that determination. And that is why the language matters. Undetermined, unresolved, pending investigation. Those words may sound unsatisfying. But in a real investigation, they are better than pretending to know something that hasn't been established. Nolan's family wants answers. The public wants answers. And investigators have now said those answers will be presented to a grand jury. The question is what the evidence will show. There is another reason this case has attracted so much attention. Nolan's family has not simply accepted the unanswered questions. They have continued pushing for additional examination. They have hired attorneys. They commissioned an independent autopsy. They have pursued forensic analysis. They have pushed for the phone to be examined. And they have asked for a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding their son's death. Civil rights organizations have also joined the family's calls for greater scrutiny. Reuters reported that the NOC joined the legal effort in August, while members of the Congressional Black Caucus have called for federal involvement. But again, calls for further investigation do not themselves prove wrongdoing. They demonstrate that the case has raised enough concern for outside organizations to demand additional scrutiny. And ultimately, scrutiny is exactly what the evidence needs, because if the official evidence confirms an accidental death, that conclusion should be based on evidence. If it reveals something different, that should also be based on evidence. Either way, Nolan's family deserves an answer that can withstand scrutiny. So let's return to the question we started with. If someone told you that your friend stayed behind on an island, but his phone appeared to have returned, would you stop asking questions? Probably not. You would want to know what happened. And that's exactly what Nolan's family has been doing. But now the investigation has reached a stage where those questions need to be answered by evidence. The phone needs to be examined. The autopsy findings need to enter the legal process. The timeline needs to be reconstructed. Witness accounts need to be compared against independent records. And the evidence eventually needs to be presented to the grand jury. Because there is one thing that cannot be recovered: time. The hours between Nolan's last confirmed movements and the discovery of his body are gone. Investigators can't go back to July 4th. They can't recreate every conversation. They can't watch everything that happened. But they can examine what remains: the phone, the records, the photographs, the videos, the GPS data, the emergency calls, the forensic evidence, the witness statements, and the autopsy. All of it has to be placed on the same timeline. And if there is a contradiction, it needs an explanation. If there is a gap, investigators need to determine why. If there is evidence that clears someone, that matters too. Because the purpose of an investigation isn't to prove a predetermined theory, it's to find out what happened. Nolan Wells would have turned 19 this August. Instead, his family is still waiting for answers about how their 18-year-old son died. The official autopsy is complete. The findings remain unreleased. The grand jury process is ahead, and the phone that could potentially help reconstruct Nolan's final hours has still not undergone the joint forensic examination his family says it is ready for. For Nolan's family, this isn't simply another update in an ongoing investigation. Yesterday was his 19th birthday. And instead of celebrating another year of his life, his family was left remembering the son they lost while still asking the same question they've been asking since July. What happened to Nolan? That's why these unanswered questions matter. Not because they prove a particular theory, not because they give anyone permission to accuse someone, but because somewhere inside those missing hours is the truth about what happened to an 18-year-old who went to Horn Island on July 4th and never came home. Until the evidence can tell us exactly what happened, Nolan Wells' case remains unresolved. And one day after his 19th birthday, his family is still waiting for the answers he never got the chance to give them. Until then, the most honest conclusion is also the hardest one. We still don't know exactly what happened to Nolan Wells, but we do know there are questions that still need answers. And those questions aren't going away. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Nolan Wells investigation? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.